I would like to say good evening to NOFA Nation. My name is Paul Bertler, and I'm going to be your host tonight. I am a NOFA Mass volunteer. I'm also a board member and a summer conference coordinator. You are attending the Vermicomposting for Home and Farm workshop with Ben Goldberg and Julia Latady. We have a number of sponsors who help make our conference possible, and I encourage you to purchase from them. And when you do, let them know you appreciate their support of NOFA. Most importantly, we want to thank you, the viewers and listeners, especially our members who make our education and advocacy work possible. We are presenting and attending and hosting this workshop from land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on this map and honor those whose land you now occupy. This interactive map can be found at native-land.ca. And for all of our attendees beyond the New England area, the map is a global resource, so it's definitely cool and feel free to check it out. One final note, we are going to have everyone's lines muted during the call, so if anyone unmutes their line and I pick up any extra background noise, I might mute you. So keep your lines muted until we have that time for questions at the end. So with that, distinguished guests, I am now pleased to introduce Ben and Julia.
So I'm here with Ben Goldberg. My name is Julia Latady, and I'm excited to talk to you all tonight about vermicomposting and getting started either at home or on the farm. My name is Julia. I've been working with worms for 6 years, just as a hobby. I met Ben this past year and have been starting to build some worm bins with him and learn a little bit more about vermicomposting and getting a bit more involved. Ben has been vermicomposting for about 25 years. He has a workshop in Sunderland and he builds bins, works with worms, sells bins. He also works with composting toilets. And so we're both very interested in critters and the ecosystem of the bin and with worms themselves. So we are excited to teach you guys some more. So let's see what we will cover this evening. We're going to go over a bit of worm biology. We're going to learn how to build or buy your own worm bin. Talk about how to keep your worms healthy once you have the worms in your bin and how to keep them happy so that they're producing some compost for you. And then we'll get into how to harvest that compost or that vermicast, the fancy word for it, and what to do with them. And then if anyone is interested, we'll get into a larger scale vermicomposting farming with worms, explore that together. And then we'll go into our questions and discussion. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to, as Paul was saying, add them to the chat right now if you don't think you'll remember them at the end, and we'll get to them all at the end. That way we'll just get through the whole presentation together first. So why do we even want to vermicompost? Well, we all produce food waste. Some of us are pretty good at composting our food waste already. Some of us not so much, and we send that food waste to landfills. Even if we compost at home, oftentimes the facilities we're going to are schools, hospitals, anywhere that you're going and eating, and restaurants producing food waste, that will oftentimes go into the landfill. And food in the landfill that rots is rotting anaerobically. It's producing a lot of methane that is going into the environment as a greenhouse gas. So if we can compost at home, if we can compost in smaller systems like worm bin systems, it can be more accessible for people. So it lets us reduce our food waste going into landfill. The worms also add an extra boost to the soil. Their castings or their poop contain beneficial microbes that boost the soil vitality, help build soil structure, increase your plant yield, and they can actually help your plants with resistance to disease and pests. It goes beyond food waste. For those of us with livestock or farms that have a lot of manure from your livestock, you can actually vermicompost your manure as well. Got a moth in my eye. So animal manure that is already composted partially, pre-cooked, or even colder manures like rabbit manure is really great. You can add those into your worm bin or into your larger system. So it gives us a chance to generate and use locally sourced fertilizer rather than buying from outside sources. It's also just a fun and educational project that you can do for yourself with kids. If you have kids on the farm, if you run any summer programs or camps, if you are a classroom teacher, it's a great way to get kids involved with that system of building soil and growing good food. And not to mention the benefit to us, getting your hands in that bin and connecting with that environment and with that, all those microbes in there is actually beneficial to our own bodies to have that diversity of bacteria and fungus on our hands. It helps to, having that diversity helps to outcompete any of the bad stuff. So just a little bonus for us. There are over 7,000 species of earthworms in the class Latady. So you might remember from biology that worms are categorized in the phylum Annelida. Further down into the class, Latady are our, what we consider earthworms. They're the ones that have that clitellum. We'll get a little into the anatomy in a bit. And only a few of those species are really good at vermicomposting. And the characteristics that make them really good at composting, that they're tolerant of crowded conditions. They like to live at the surface. They don't like those deep, deep burrows, which would be hard to replicate at home. They don't create a smell themselves. They might smell if the bin is not managed well, but they don't release a smell when they're bothered. And they're voracious eaters. So let's see. We were given these illustrations from Rick Colath, these wonderful illustrations that he made for some academic textbooks. So I'm excited to use these, illustrating the 3 different ecological groups of earthworms. So we have our anisic worms. They tend to burrow really deep, vertical burrows. They're going deep, deep down. They're actually pulling food from the surface, leaves oftentimes, and they'll pull them down into their burrows to eat. Then they'll pop back up to leave their castings. Not so great for vermicompost because you really need to accommodate those deep burrows. There are also endogeic worms. They tend to make those horizontal burrows. They're soil feeders, so they're just scooping up whatever they can get in the soil, churning up that soil. They tend to be a medium size. You've probably seen them in your garden. Also not so great for vermicomposting because they need that deeper soil to live in and to move through, and they like to travel. But then we have our epigeic earthworms. They tend to live at the surface in the leaf litter. They are voracious feeders and they don't have those requirements of a deep burrow. So they tend to be helpful. We have the most common species used in composting is the red wiggler, Asania fetida. So they are living in the leaf litter. They are voracious eaters. They reproduce quickly. They actually can eat a lot. They eat up to half their body weight to even their full body weight in one day, which is awesome. And they can double their population in 60 to 90 days. So if you start with just a few worms in favorable conditions, if they're really happy and they have the food they need and they have the space they need, they can reproduce really quickly and you'll end up with lots of worms to eat your compost. It's great. Oh, and we have a little video of a red wiggler.
Worms?
I got a worm. Yeah, there he goes. I just wanted to see why it's called red wigglers. They just jump all over the place.
Uh-huh.
Check this.
So did you see that little jumping movement? That's why it has the name red wiggler. And that was Ben's voice there. Ben will pop up in the end to help answer some questions if you're wondering where he is. All right. So earthworms, their anatomy is really important for us to know as we're raising the worms, if we decide to build a bin ourselves and get started. They're our livestock. We have to know how to take care of them so that we can be good livestock guardians and really help them thrive. So Each segment, remember we talked about how worms are annelids, they're segmented. Annelid actually means little rings in Latin. And you can see each of these segments have these tiny little hair-like projections on them called setae. And that is what they use to move. So they'll actually plant that setae, which is so small that we can't really see it with the naked eye. They'll plant it in the ground and move the other segments forward. And then move that segment that was planted. And that's how they can move forward to the ground. As they move, they open that mouth. And just like a baleen whale that's filter feeding, their mouth will expand and take in everything in their path that can fit. And so they're eating the bacteria, they're eating the fungus, they're eating the little food particles. And it's passing through their mouth into their digestive system and to the crop, where just like a bird will have a crop, and from the crop into the gizzard. And the gizzard is specialized for mechanical digestion, for using grit, which they're also scooping up from their environment, bits of gravel, sand, and that's helping them grind up their food in the gizzard. From the gizzard, it passes into the intestines, where what they need to grow and to thrive and to reproduce is absorbed into their body. And something is happening in there where the microbes that came in, the bacteria and the fungus that came in, is just thriving in there. It's multiplying the good stuff, the diversity of it, and it's coming out the other end into the castings, and that's what's really great for our garden. To reproduce, worms are actually hermaphrodites, so each worm has both male and female parts to them. They do need to reproduce sexually, though. They can't clone themselves. So the male and the female will align, and they'll each deposit sperm onto the other, and they'll actually start, once this is happening, they'll start to create a mucus layer on their clitellum. And as they're getting ready, as they're mating, the mucus layer will grow and they'll start to slither out of the mucus. And as the mucus travels along their body from their clitellum, this middle part, it will pick up the eggs and then it will pick up the sperm. So the eggs from the worm that has the clitellum, and then from the sperm from the other worm that it mated with. And this is happening on both worms at the same time. As it reaches the end of the worm, I think I have a picture here. As it reaches the end of the worm, it starts to seal and become what we call a cocoon. So you can see these photos of these mating worms lined up, inverted against each other. And then this third photo has the cocoon sliding off. And each cocoon tends to have 4 to 6 live red wigglers. And actually in this photo, you can see the yellow cocoons. When they're first deposited, they start to turn yellow. As they get older, they get darker and darker until they hatch. And you can peek into them and you can see the little red wiggler worms wiggling around. So here's a recent cocoon, the more yellow one, and then you can see the scale with the penny next to it, a darker cocoon that I think had 3 red wigglers in it. So we know about our livestock. How do we get started? How do we build or buy our first worm bin? So we're gonna go through the 6 main points to help you get started yourself. How to build a bin. If you want, you can start right off by buying a bin. Tends to be a little bit more sophisticated. Maybe you don't want to spend the money right away. Maybe you want to see if you can DIY it. So Rubbermaid bins are these big, any bins that you have lying around, you want to make sure that they're food safe because you're going to be putting live creatures in there and then adding the waste to your garden. But Rubbermaid bins work well. You don't need it to be any more than 1 foot or 1.5 feet deep. And you're going to need your bins, ideally 2 bins, so that you can have a reservoir system, and we'll get into that, a drill to poke some holes for aeration, and bedding materials and grit. We'll get into how to build your bedding as well. So you can see this bin that I made the other day. We have holes in the lid that allows for aeration, for air circulation, so your worms can breathe. Worms are breathing through their skin, so they actually need oxygen, but they also need a moist environment. And then I poked some holes along the sides that really helps with that circulation. This third photo here is the bottom bin, the reservoir. So what you can do if you have 2 bins is you can actually poke some holes in the bottom of the first bin and nest it into the second bin. And that way, if your bedding becomes too wet, think as you're adding food in, as food breaks down, it starts to leak out this leachate. That can all drain into the second bin, so you're not stuck with this too wet of an environment for the worms. And then once it's all ready, you can add your bedding in. There are also options to purchase a bin if you're feeling like you want to get started with something a bit more sophisticated than a homemade bin. Ben makes and sells bins. We have the website. You can take a look at what he has to offer. One of the bins is this aerobic tote bin. And the cool thing about this bin is it actually has a reservoir at the bottom that is built in and a little bit fancier than my version. And it has this spigot. So as you're feeding your worms, if there's too much moisture, it will drain down into the reservoir, which is specially made so the worms can't get in there and drown. And then you can just drain it right out. It also has these vents on it, which instead of just poking holes with a drill, a little bit fancier, they have screens so that you don't have to worry about other little critters getting into your bin, like flies and sow bugs, and we'll get into some other critters that might show up. So that helps with that. There's another option to go with a wooden long bin and using a linear migration method. So we'll get into that terminology and how to use it. But just another style of worm bin, especially if you want to get right off the bat into a larger worm farm. So worm bin bedding. Ideally, you want bedding that is light and fluffy and that will retain moisture well as your worms are moving through it. You need it to be fluffy so that the worms can wiggle through it and access the food. We also need a grit source in the bedding. So as you're starting your worm bin, you can add in sand or gravel, very fine gravel. You might have that in your soil already. A nice handful of soil is actually really beneficial. It brings in some of those microbes to start your bin off. Another great grit source are ground up eggshells. So just sticking them in a blender and pulsating until it is a fine powder. Just try not to breathe it in. And then adding that into your bin can be a great grit source, but also beneficial for balancing the pH and just there's been some research showing that that helps worms with reproduction as well. So some great materials for bedding. Leaf mulch. Ben actually has a bedding where he uses cranberry leaf mulch from Cape Cod, where the cranberry farms are actually just dumping their spent leaves into these big piles, which do break down, but slowly and sometimes anaerobically. So if we can utilize that waste product and give it to the worms, that's a great thing to do. Manure, you want to make sure it's not too hot of a manure, so it's not actively breaking down with heat, which could burn your worms. So rabbit manure is really great. Llama, alpaca manure, a slightly aged sheep manure. You can use hog and cow manure, but you want to give it some time to age first. Coconut coir is, you can buy online, you can buy in garden stores. It usually comes in these dehydrated bricks that you can just add water to, put in your bin. I find that helpful because it helps to regulate the wetness in your bin. So if you're finding that your bin is too dry, you just add wetter coconut coir. If it's too wet, you add some dry stuff and it soaks up all that moisture. The worms seem to love it too. It's also, the bedding is not just for them to live in and sleep in, they're also actually eating that as well. Coffee chaff is a waste product from coffee roasting. So it's the stuff coming off the beans. You can ask a coffee roaster nearby if you can have their chaff. I think Ben gets it from Dean's Beans. And then a common bedding is shredded newspaper. You just want to be careful with newspaper because the chemicals that are used in the process of adding the dyes to the newspaper might be safe when the newspaper is dry, but as you're adding water and over time adding more of the ink, especially colored ink, into your bin. I've definitely done it before, but it could be detrimental to the worms into the garden. So definitely worth. I think there's a cat. So let's see. And cardboard is really good, especially cardboard that doesn't have color, to shred that up, especially right now as we're all getting a lot of packages. So it's hard to shred the cardboard by hand, but if you let it soak in a bin of water or wheelbarrow overnight, it gets really pliable and you can break that up. You want it to mix all together and just create this really nice broken down fluffy stuff for the worms. So once you have your bedding in there, it can be helpful to get your worm bin set up and then wait a week or two before you add the worms. That way you're just making sure that everything settles. You're giving the bacteria and fungi in there a chance to settle in. You're making sure that it doesn't become too thermophilic and start to heat up, which would be bad for your worms. And you also have a chance to really get to know the moisture levels. So we like to say that bedding should be as wet as a wrung out sponge. So picture your sponge at your sink, you get it wet and you really wring it out, and that feeling, it's not soaking wet, it's not dripping, but it's not dry either. So if you reach into your bedding and you squeeze it and it stays mostly in that squeezed clump, just loosely in that clump, that's a good consistency. If it starts to squelch and really like gets into a mud ball, too wet, and if it crumbles apart, too dry. Worms prefer a pH of 6 to 7. You don't need to go out and test your pH levels unless you want to, which could be fun. But just start to get a sense of when the worms are, if the worms are uncomfortable, you'll see them start to move out of the bin, and we'll get into that too. And also any problems in your bin tend to go hand in hand. So if your bedding is too wet, oftentimes it means that the pH is also off. And same thing with it being dry. Temperature, ideally they like 50 to 80. They won't be as productive if it's under 50 or over 80 at the extremes of either level. You could have die off. But your worms are really good at acclimating and adapting to changes in a bin. It just might be a little slow if they're extremes. But there are people that keep their worms, Ben and I were just talking about this, they keep their worms in Florida outside, and they have a population of worms that has adapted over time to be well suited to that environment. And the same thing with New England winters. There are people that keep their worms outside year round, and the hardier worms have survived and the less hardy worms have not. So it's pretty cool to watch that evolution happen. Worms have photosensitive skin, so they don't like the light. They like to be in the darkness. So having a bin that has darker sides is preferable. If you only have bins with clear sides, they don't like it as much, but you can mitigate that by adding fabric around the sides or keeping them in a dark spot. And they don't like salt. That can burn their skin. So that's something to note if you're adding manure. Sometimes manure has the urine in it as well or on it, and you just want to be conscious of that as you're adding manure, knowing that you might be adding salts as well. It's another good reason to let your manure cook a little bit first. So how do we feed our worms? We have our bin, we have our bedding all set up, we have our worms. I should also mention a good place to get worms. You can get them online. I got my worms at a website called Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. They tend to be the most popular place to get worms. You can ask around in your community, see if anyone is willing to sell you or give you worms and build your population that way. But there are many places, both online and in your community, that you can find worms. So you have your bin, you have your bedding, you have your worms. What do we feed them? We know that they will consume about half to full body weight a day. So you want to make sure that you're feeding them enough to maintain and build their population, but not too much that it's getting too stinky in there, that food is starting to break down anaerobically. They tend to prefer the softer fruit and veggie scraps. It's just easy, it breaks down, it decomposes more quickly. There's a whole ecosystem in there. There are other things breaking down that food too, and then the worms are just coming in and eating what fits in their mouth. So the softer it is, the smaller the pieces, the easier it is for them to break down and become accessible for the worms. You can, if you have the time, chop or grind your food up. That increases the surface area of the food and it speeds up the process, makes it more accessible to the worms more quickly. Ben uses this wood chipper here, a modified wood chipper, and he gets a lot of produce from the Leverett Co-op and just grinds that all up. It comes out as this mash. And the other good thing about grinding your food up is as you're doing that, the water that's in those veggies or those fruits is starting to be released, and you can let that drain before putting it in your bin. And that can help with maintaining your moisture levels in the bin. So a nice bucket with holes in it, putting the food in there, covering it so the flies don't find it, and then just letting it drain for a bit can be helpful. Worms, especially if you're using a small bin or using a small area, you really want to maximize that real estate. There are certain foods that they don't like. In a large system, they probably will eat it, or maybe you'll have bacteria and fungus in there that will be helping to break it down. But in general, especially when you're starting off, they really prefer those softer foods. They don't really like spicy foods like onions, garlic, hot peppers. They don't like citrus, acidic foods, citrus or pineapple. Baked goods they will eat, and but the thing is it will start to mold. And the mold is okay for the worms. They don't mind, but you might mind. So tend to steer away from baked goods, especially in a smaller system. And then the same thing with clumpy cooked foods, oatmeal, your leftover grains from dinner. They will eat them, but more slowly, and it tends to clump up and create those anaerobic conditions where oxygen isn't getting in, and the bacteria that colonizes the anaerobic areas is different from the aerobic bacteria, and they tend to be stinkier. So it tends to be problematic from our standpoint, and the worms don't like it as much either. And the same thing with meat and dairy. In a big system, they can go through it. It's slower, and by the time they're getting to it, it's probably starting to smell or attract some unwanted guests like blowfly larvae. So we tend to steer away from that in our smaller systems when we're first getting started. So let's troubleshoot a little. You are ready to go. You have your worms, you have your bin, you have your bedding. What's going wrong? These are the most common issues that we see when you're first getting started, even when you've been doing it for many, many years. Like I just had a mite explosion in my bins. So it happens, it's okay. Let's figure out what we can do. Very common, your bin is too wet. We've talked about it a little bit where you notice it's too wet, you might start getting stinky because of it's anaerobic. You might start to see some mites showing up. They like the wetter conditions. You might notice the sounds are different as you're moving your hands through the bin. It might start to make sucky, popping, squelching sounds like muddy. So if this happens, you can open the bin up to let some more air in. You can try to add some more dry bedding. Like I was saying, the coconut coir tends to be really great for this, or shredded cardboard. You can do a little bit of gentle stirring in your bin. They tend to not like to be stirred up, but to get those pockets of anaerobic conditions moving about the bin tends to be beneficial. Because once you add air to the bacteria that is in an anaerobic condition, they can't survive. So they die and the smell goes away. If your bin starts to become too dry, you can just add some more water. Starts to get crumbly. You notice maybe your worms are disappearing or drying out. I like to keep a spray bottle next to my bins. Make sure that the water is non-chlorinated. If you are on town water and your water is chlorinated, you can just let it sit out for a day or two to let that dissipate. and just add that to mist the bedding, mist the sides of the bin to create that condensation, and they will like that. You can also add some wetter bedding, like that soaked cardboard can work really well. Keep the lid on your bin, that can help. If your bin is too acidic, and I tend to go off of smell, I don't know, maybe other people don't as much, but I can smell if my bin starts to get a little bit like sweet, sickly smelling. I know it might be a little acidic. If you start to get a population boom of mites, tends to be acidic. These things go hand in hand. You can add the crushed eggshells, which are great for the worms for their digestion, are great to balance that pH, and are also probably good for the worms in their reproduction too. So just about half a cup, if you're doing a Rubbermaid size bin, half a cup of eggshells, really ground into a fine powder like this picture here, and add those to your bin, and then wait for them to disappear, and then you can add more. And by disappear, I mean the worms have been processing them and the other bacteria has been processing them, and you don't see them in your bin after a couple weeks. You can start to add more if needed. If your bin is too stinky, it's probably anaerobic. So we've really touched on this a lot, but wet conditions. Usually it happens when you're feeding too much. You're just overzealous and you want to get all your compost in there, and the worms can't keep up with it. They're not, they don't have a big enough population, or maybe they're stressed for some other reason. So you start to build up that leachate, that broken down food liquid mixed with anaerobic bacteria, and it starts to get really stinky. So same with a wet bin, you can really add some bedding to absorb that moisture. If you have a reservoir bin, you can drain out that leachate. That can be helpful. You want to maybe add some more air holes if you're able to in your bin, if it's a homemade bin. And just as a heads up, a tip, you probably don't want to touch the stinky stuff with your bare hands, like in this photo, because it tends to get on your hands and smell really bad for a while. So use a spoon or use gloves, and Ben's nodding over there because he did it the other day for this photo op. So let's see. Flies oftentimes goes hand in hand with a bin that is too wet. You get fungus gnats, fruit flies. It also sometimes will happen with, depending on the food you're feeding them. Fruit flies tend to show up in banana skins that you buy from the store. They tend to have their eggs in there already. So if you're adding banana skins, banana peels to your bin, the fruit flies will hatch and be thrilled that you've given them such a great system to live in, and they'll really take over. So to avoid that, you can try freezing food scraps before you add it to your bin. That will help to kill the fly eggs. You can also create a fly trap like this little homemade version. It's just a plastic water bottle, some high value food at the bottom. I used wine. They love that. Or bananas are really enticing for fruit flies. And then a sticky note at the top. I roll it into a cone shape, and the sticky tape sticks to the paper, and you just stick it right in the bottle, and the flies go in, and they like to fly up. They can't figure out how to get up through the cone. That tends to work really well. You might also see black soldier fly larvae show up in your bin. These are the larval form, the babies of a black soldier fly, which looks a little bit more like a wasp, the adult form. The larvae look like a big, I've heard them described as a big cuddly maggot. They're like a grayish color. They don't look like your typical gooey maggot. And if they are showing up, it might mean that your bin is anaerobic or that you're overfeeding. But these guys are actually pretty cool. They are composters in themselves. And some people actually manage their bin just for the black soldier fly larvae. So if you get them in your bin, in my opinion, you're lucky. They're actually really great chicken food. So just pull it out, feed it to your chicken. They won't bite you, as far as I know. And they have a really high percentage of calcium. So they're really great for chickens. So really not much of a problem in your worm bin. What are these other creatures in my bin? So worm bins are actually a really complex, diverse ecosystem of fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates. The worms are one of the invertebrates. You probably won't see the fungus or the bacteria unless the fungus starts to fruit because they're microscopic, but you will sometimes see additional invertebrates like this little guy here. This is a house centipede. And so some invertebrates that you might see, and I have some videos coming up, so we'll take a look at them. The red and white mites, tiny, tiny little arachnids, 8 legs. Centipedes like this guy here. Millipedes tend to be more slow moving than the centipede, more rounded, 4 legs per segment instead of the 2 of the centipede. You might see springtail mites. Those are pretty cool. They're categorized as columbola. They're separate from insects, but they are very close to insects. They have those 6 legs, and they have a special spring appendage on their belly that they can use to bounce off of the surfaces that they're on. And so you might see them bouncing around in there. They tend to be white and pretty small. You might see some spiders, especially if you have flies. The spiders might set up camp to help you with your fly problem. And some other little guys called potworms are these tiny little white worms. Oftentimes people will see them and say, look, baby worms, thinking they're the baby red wigglers. They're actually a different species. They're not hurting anything. They're helping the bin ecosystem. A general rule of thumb, if it's moving slowly, it's beneficial, it's fine. If it's moving quickly, it's probably a predator because it's chasing the other guys down, and you might want to remove it from your bin. I mean, it depends on your tolerance. I have a high tolerance for this whole ecosystem. I love seeing who's showed up in the bin. But if you are, and my bins are in my garage, so I can do that. But if you have bins inside in your house and you have family members or roommates who have a lower tolerance, or maybe it's in your classroom and your principal doesn't like that, you might want to try to manage for these other critters and remove them, bring them out into the compost pile or outside. Just be careful if you do have centipedes, they can bite. Be careful as you catch them. So here is a video of my mite population explosion. They love liquidy foods, watery foods, so watermelon, cantaloupe. I fed too much watermelon and they were very happy. So you can see the little round mites, and then these longer guys are the springtails. And then also have a video of the potworms here. Those 2 white little wiggly guys are the potworms. Great. All right. Another problem you might have, especially as you're just adding your first worms to the bin, they might start to escape. They wiggle up the sides of the bin. And if you don't have a lid, they can get right out of the bin. What they're telling you is that they're not happy inside the bedding that you've made them. It might just be because they're not used to it. They're new, they're used to their old bedding, and they're like, hey, I want to find my old home, and they just are trying to escape. Or it might be because your conditions are not ideal. Maybe your bin has become too wet or too dry, too acidic, too hot. So they're trying to self-regulate and find a new home. So that is a clue that you need to manage your bin and try to figure out what is going wrong. Try to troubleshoot using those other points that we were talking about. But if they are just new to your bin and just having a hard time adjusting, a quick fix is to put a bright light above the bin. You just want to make sure that it's not it's not creating heat and heating up the bedding, but they're averse to the light, so they're going to burrow into that bedding to stay away from the light. You just don't want to do that if there is a problem with your bin and you're sort of torturing them by making them burrow in and they're really unhappy. So it's a good solution when you're first getting the worms, but maybe not so much when all of a sudden they're trying to escape. They're telling you something. Worm insurance. So when I first started with my worm bins, I put too much rabbit manure in one bin and probably a lot of rabbit urine just on the manure, and my colony collapsed. they burned. So luckily I had given some worms and bins to friends and families I was working with, and I was able to rebuild my colony. They were able to give it back to me. So I call that worm insurance. It's a win-win because you get to spread the worm word and give worms to other people, get them started vermicomposting as well. And then if your colony collapses for some reason, which sometimes happens, you get to bring back some worms and you don't have to buy them again. So don't tell Uncle Jim's Worm Farm that I'm telling you this, but I think it's a great solution. Worm bin rewards. Why are we doing all this? What is the benefit? Why do we love the worm castings? How do we harvest them when the worms are done? And what do we do with them? So this is a photo of some finished worm castings. You can see that nice dark rich color there. There's actually a great fact sheet and some research put out by the University of California on the benefits of worm castings. So they really, as we were talking about, as they pass through the gut, they're really picking up that microbial diversity and abundance, and it's coming out the other end. So it's adding soil structure. It's also each particle of all the nutrients coming out of the worm are wrapped up in mucus. So it's creating this like delayed release system in your garden. When you're adding a synthetic fertilizer to the garden, it's a rapid release. The plants use what they can, and everything else starts to move out of reach of plants. It starts to wash away with rains. It becomes pollution, whereas worm castings are actually adding to the soil and are accessible to the plants for a longer time. They are really rich in iron, sulfur, calcium. They have a high NPK rating, so they're nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And they're more rich in nutrients than compost. So compost is great, but worm compost or vermicast is just a richer source of those nutrients, so you can use less of it. Research is showing that it's improving our leaf, our flower size, our quality of fruit, and it's not only improving the yield, but it's giving the plants a better fighting chance to protect themselves against pests and to protect against disease. It actually helps the plants raise their sugar levels, which can help with that. So let's talk about harvesting our worm bins. There's the linear migration method, which you can do with a small bin. It also works really well for a larger scale system. So if you have a home bin, a small Rubbermaid bin, what you want to do is as the bin is finishing, as you are noticing it's getting really heavy, the bin is getting full. It's mostly castings at this point. There's not enough room to add more food and bedding. It's time to harvest. And sometimes you can let it cure for a week or so, stop feeding the worms, let them just really finish up what's in there and break it down. And then you'll want to remove half of the bin and set it aside in a new bin. And then move the rest of the contents in the bin to one side. So you have a bin that has half vermicast and half empty space. Then you can add in some fresh bedding and really appealing food. So cantaloupe is a favorite, watermelon. The idea is the worms from the finished half are moving into this new half. And you can then harvest the castings and really start your bin over. And you're doing the same thing with that other half of the finished castings and worms that you've moved into a different different bin. So the benefits of this system, it's not very time consuming. You can do it pretty quickly. It's low effort. It works really well for a larger scale system if you have the bin that's already built as a linear migration bin, which we have some pictures coming up. It does tend to take up a lot of space, so it might not be the ideal situation if you're limited in space. And it also doesn't tend to be super thorough. So you're relying on those worms to migrate themselves to a new fresh bedding and new fresh food, but you might have some dawdlers on the other side, especially the cocoons that the worms have left behind that haven't hatched. They're not moving. Any small babies that just aren't quick enough or haven't really figured out where the food is. So that finished section, you're going to want to comb through a little bit, or just wait longer give them time to all move. And yeah, it takes up a lot of space, but that's great. If you have the space and you have a lot of worms, it's really a handy method. So here's one of the linear migration bins that Ben has made. And basically you start, and you can see in this bottom picture here, you start with one compartment as the feeding compartment. The bottom of the bin is open, but has hardware cloth so that rodents can't get in. And then it has landscape fabric so the worms can't get out, but you're getting that airflow in and you're letting the leachate drain out. And so you're feeding one section of the bin, filling it up. Once it's full, you can remove that landscape cloth from that divider section, and the worms can start to migrate through the hardware cloth. They can fit through and into that new section with new bedding and new food. And this bin is great. The size of it, you can let it slowly occur over time. So all those dawdlers are moving out of that first section. And I have a video here.
I'm just kind of quickly sifting through it. The worms.
Melon in your hand too, or is that just a melon?
Little critter.
Right now we're sifting through to find any dawdlers,
like,
slower worms, there's one there. Cocoons.
But very few compared to. We only just started, I think it's 2 weeks since we did this, started the second bin. There's a few in there.
So he's taking the finished castings. It's hard to see with the lighting, but this section, this full section, is actually much darker and richer than the new section. And taking those finished castings, sifting through really quickly, making sure there are no dawdlers, which there are a few, and then adding those to the finished bucket. Any worms or cocoons that we find left behind go into the new section. On a smaller scale, there's also the light avoidance method that tends to work really well if you are using a small bin at home. It can be fun to do with kids as a school project or a farm education project. So you want to find a sunny day, no rain, or if you're inside, make sure you have a bright light, because remember the worms like to escape from the light. And you're going to take your finished bin, that heavy, full bin, and just dump it all onto the table. Form a bit of a volcano or a row, like a mountain range. Any exposed worms, as the bin is dumped out, will just quickly burrow into the bedding to try to avoid the light. And then once they've done that, you can scrape away the topmost layer and put that into a separate pile. And that should be pure castings, the finished product. Once you start to, as you're digging through, once you start to see worms again, then it's time to let it settle, let the worms burrow in again. They want to avoid that light. Wait 10 to 15 minutes and then come and repeat the process. So you're just going to repeat that process until you're left with a pile of mostly worms and a separate pile of finished castings. And as you're doing that, you're keeping an eye out for the cocoons, adding them to a fresh worm bin, and any stragglers are going into the pile. So the benefit of this method, it's very thorough because you're doing that work. Especially if you can also sift through, you can have a hardware cloth and a frame and really sift through the finished product to make sure you're getting all those cocoons, because they can be hard to see. But it is time consuming and high effort. But you can make a day out of it. You can invite friends over with their bins. You can invite kids over. It can be really fun. And you can also get some other projects done in those 10 to 15 minutes in between harvests. So I did a little mini harvest the other day. You can see that my pile, my bin wasn't completely done. I still have some leaves and shavings, but as I formed that volcano, all the bigger bits actually fell down to the bottom and I could just easily scrape those away. Another benefit of this method is then you get to see how many worms you are left with. Do you have more worms than you started with? Do you have fewer? What happened? That can be a really good data point for you as you go forward with your worm farming. And can also be helpful if you're looking to give some worms away or sell some worms. Tells you how much you have. How to use your castings. So you've harvested them, we're ready to use them. We know the benefits, we're ready to go. You can top dress on existing plants, just sprinkle some on the soil on top. I use them on all my houseplants, so you can see those happy houseplants with worm castings. You can add them to your potting mixes just as an ingredient as you're forming your mix. But the biggest bang for your buck is to make a compost tea, a vermicompost tea. Just a quick note, I've talked about the leachate, which is the liquid that is forming in your bin as food breaks down. It's the anaerobic liquid. Sometimes people will refer to that as compost tea. It's not the same thing. It's like the waste from the bin. Some people will use it on their plants, and you can definitely do that, just with a caveat that sometimes it tends to be where the not so nice bacteria hangs out, like E. coli. It doesn't necessarily have E. coli, but it could. So just something to note. But you can make a more aerated tea either by just steeping your finished castings in a bucket overnight before all the oxygen runs out in the water, and then using that on your plants. Or you can do a slightly more sophisticated version where you're really brewing a tea using a air pump and some sort of bubbler to really aerate that water as you're brewing. So this is my setup. It's you definitely don't need these fancy things to get started. I got started with just an air pump that I got for free. And an old air stone that I got for free. I have since upgraded to a slightly fancier version, but really don't feel like you need to start out with the fancy stuff. You just need a bucket, you need some sort of air pump, some sort of aquarium tubing, an air stone, like if you've ever kept an aquatic pet, that thing that's creating the bubbles in the aquarium. I just bought this thing called a bubble snake, which helps to increase the surface area of bubbles, adds a little more aeration, but you don't need to do that. Some sort of mesh bag to hold your vermicast, dechlorinated water, rainwater works well, and your castings. If you want to get fancy and use these more higher tech supplies, the Tea Lab is a great resource. Their website is composttealab.com, and they have the air pumps, they have the bubble snake. I actually did the math, and if you buy these things separately, it comes out to more money than buying the kit. So they have a beginner kit that you can buy. And I'm happy to share any of these resources, like the fact sheet on the benefits of Vermicast and the website. Just send us an email after the presentation and I can get all those resources to you. And we'll have our email at the end as well. So I let it steep. You may have seen the video that Nofa put up on Facebook or on Instagram of the process. And basically you're aerating that water, you're steeping the compost in there with the vermicast in there. And you can do this with compost as well, but it's better with the vermicast for 24 to 48 hours generally. And it's creating this really beneficial environment for the microbes to really bloom and grow. And then you end up with this finished product, this darker solution that you can then dilute, usually about 1 gallon of water to 4 cups of this tea. Not for us to drink, it's for our plants to drink. So we've hopefully convinced you that worm farming is fun and really beneficial for your garden or your farm or even your houseplants. But what if you want to get started on a larger scale? What if you want to process larger quantities of food waste or manure from your farm. What if you want more castings to add to your own farm, or maybe you want to sell them? You want that additional source of revenue for your farm. Or maybe you're just really interested in creating those closed systems on site where you're creating all your fertilizer needs on farm instead of buying in from outside resources. So we're going to explore some of the styles of worm farming on a larger scale and get into a couple case studies. But if you're interested in this, I definitely recommend picking up the Worm Farmer's Handbook by Rhonda Sherman. She is really the expert on vermicomposting at a larger scale, and even at a small scale, this book is still helpful, but it gets into the business planning side if you want to turn this into a viable business. If you go online and search for the book, Chelsea Green is the publisher, and they actually have a really generous preview online where you can read, I think it's about 86 pages of the book without purchasing it, just to get a sense of it. Also, as part of the NOFA conference, Chelsea Green has offered a 35% discount to all attendees, so it's a good chance to get your books. So larger scale systems, that linear bin is a great option. We call that a continuous flow system on a larger scale. So this photo is actually courtesy of Berkshire Worms. They're based out in Lanesboro, Mass, out in the Berkshires. And we'll get into their case study a bit later, but this is their bin that they use, that they're really moving a lot of food waste through, and they're running their business on that. There are also some even larger systems, like dairy, processing dairy waste in New York. They've been building these huge warehouse-size mechanical harvesting systems. As the worms are processing the food waste, the castings end up at the bottom, and they actually are moving up as you're feeding from the top. So if you are able to harvest from the bottom of your system, it's just much more efficient. So there are some mechanical systems that you can purchase or build at a much larger scale. A slightly more natural way of doing it, you can create outdoor trenches with or windrows to try to raise your worms outside if you are limited on indoor space. And basically the trenches and windrows are allowing them to have a more regulated temperature. And then you can feed along the row and they'll process it as you go. It doesn't tend to be an issue of, you might think, oh, but if they're outside, they might escape and I won't have any worms. As long as you're managing the space where you want them and creating like a shelter for them and providing food, they aren't really motivated to leave unless it gets inhospitable for them. So if you are interested in learning about larger scale systems, Rhonda Sherman's book, and she also holds an annual Vermicompost conference through North Carolina State. I think it's in the fall this year. I don't know what that's going to look like because of coronavirus, but I'm sure she'll have some sort of online option. And Ben has gone to that conference and is giving 2 thumbs up right now. Why get into worm farming? What is the market for it? You might be getting into focus more on producing worms, or you might be getting into focus more on producing castings, vermicompost, and tea. So if you're focusing on worms, what are the markets for the worms? You can sell to people like you who are just getting started with worm farming or worm hobbyists. You can sell to bait and tackle shops that are looking for worms for people to fish with. Laboratories and schools are often looking for worms for research. And then animal feed. This is a photo of my axolotl Herman, who likes to eat my worms. But pet stores are often looking for sources, pet food, zoos, specialty pet stores, or hobbyists who are breeding reptiles, amphibians, are often looking for sources for their food. If you're more interested in getting into the castings and vermicompost and tea side of things, You can sell that directly to farmers and gardeners if you're not just using it for yourself. Also nurseries and garden supply stores. So we're going to look into Berkshire worms. They were generous enough to send us some photos for this presentation and talk to us a bit about what they're doing out in Lanesborough, Mass, out in the Berkshires. They are two nurses that recently, I think 3 years ago, decided to start farming. And now they've connected with a local smoothie shop. They're getting about 200 pounds of food waste from that smoothie shop, and they're processing that every single week. So that food waste is becoming vermicast, which they use to create a living soil, which they then use to grow microgreens, which is another part of their revenue source for them. They also create this compost tea, which they sell to other local gardeners and farmers in the area. This is their system, a slightly bigger picture of it. They're maximizing their space by having a double-decker version of the linear migration bin. And so they're going through 100 pounds of food waste per level per week, 200 pounds total. And they're really hoping to build more bins. Their goal is to connect with more restaurants and even directly to residents to bring in more compost so that compost isn't going to the landfill. They also build bins and sell bins. So this is another one of their bins that they've made for a customer. And like I said, they grow their microgreens. They sell their microgreens that are grown with this really great living soil. And they have a microgreen farm share. They also, as you are getting started, you might be interested, they offer a variety of products like the worm bins, and they also offer consultation services to help you get started. So I'd recommend checking out their website too. Listening Tree Cooperative, Ben has done a lot of work with them. They are a homestead cooperative, a permaculture farm in Chepachet, Rhode Island. And they have this outdoor bow shed that they use to house their vermicomposting worms that protects them from the outdoor elements. And they are next to a horse farm, and they actually bring in all the aged manure from the horse farm to feed their worms. So they have these 100-gallon totes. You can see that they have the reservoir system. So they have a little spigot to drain the leachate, and that tub right there is the leachate coming out, which they are actually using their own leachate on their plants as well. So just another way to build up your worm bins and create a larger system. So now it's your turn. Feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have for us. We're happy to answer them. Send us an email if you want any of the resources that we shared. Ben would like to welcome anyone if you send an email first and plan a time to see his site and meet his worms. And we would love to see photos of your setup, whether you have already gotten started with worms or if you get started in the future. We'd love to see what you're up to. So here are some more resources. If you want to screenshot that or send us an email, I'm happy to send those along to you. Ben also put together a really helpful pamphlet on worm bin composting. I used that as my main resource for putting together this presentation. I learned as I was doing it, which was great. And that's also available for sale online, and I believe soon to be available by download. So you can visit us at wehaveworms.com for some additional resources and links and a quick worm care sheet. Ben has his bins and bedding available for purchase, and really feel free to email us. We are happy to hear from you, any questions that you might have. So if there are any questions now.
Julia, thank you so much for, I'm going to use a quote of yours, for spreading the worm word. I really like that phrasing. So thank you so much for sharing your passion and enthusiasm. Looks like there's one question so far in the chat. when you put your worm tea on your plants or garden, how much do you use? Do you treat it just like fertilizer?
That's a good question. There's no risk of it burning your plants. You can do a foliar application. You can spray it on the leaves. I don't measure it out. I just sort of throw it out there. I'm sure there's an answer that's a little bit more precise than that. Ben, do you have any that you would like to add?
Well, let's see. So it's a little different if you're adding the worm tea when the soil is really dry. The plants will absorb it a lot quicker and benefit from that extra liquid. Sometimes you can dilute it, but I think you would just want to use it as you were watering your plant. I can dilute mine 50% and just water as usual as if it were a fertilizer application.
Great, thank you.
Help to answer your question?
I had one question that I'll ask. Can you talk a little bit more about overwintering your worms? And you showed one picture, but if you have your worms in a garage or somewhere else, can you talk a little bit more about how you handle them through the winter?
Sure. This is actually my first year having this many bins in the garage. I usually have a bin that is inside. My husband isn't thrilled about that, but we feed it to the axolotl too. This winter, we're actually moving our chickens into the garage as well. And I think I'm just going to try to do some insulation, maybe with some straw bales, hay bales. They tend to acclimate to the cold, and they then tend to adapt. So the individual is acclimating, but then the population over time will adapt. So the more hardy members will be able to survive the cold. But yeah, really just insulation. Some people will purchase a heat mat to put underneath. I would prefer not to use the electricity and see if I can manage it. But if you're worried, you can also try to bring them inside. And I don't know if you want to add to that as well.
Well, generally they don't like to freeze. So anything you can do to prevent them from freezing is an advantage. They can migrate to warmer sections of the bin, like the middle of the bin, and they'll ball up and clump up and retain their own or generate their own heat source. But whatever you can do to keep them from freezing is certainly to your advantage. We have some insulated bins made out of the walls are made out of 2-inch foam block, and that's helpful. Yeah, just do what you can to keep them from freezing. But I think Julia is correct, and it's my experience as well that they adapt to colder temperatures through their reproduction, and the ones that are hardier to the cold temperatures will survive.
And also to add, there's someone in New England that has been experimenting with overwintering worms outside, and he's just digging trenches because the deeper you go, the more regulated that temperature is. And he just keeps his worms underground in 5-gallon buckets or bigger buckets or bathtubs. He's found old bathtubs that he's buried underground, and he's experimented. And he said after the first winter he had a lot of die-off, but then after that, he was left with those really hardy worms. So I think it's definitely worth trying to experiment and seeing what works for you, and make sure that you have your worm insurance just in case it doesn't work for you.
The other thing to consider about that is that if you have die-off in the worms, the cocoons are much hardier and they'll survive through the cold weather. The other thing that I always kind of encourage myself by is that worms have been surviving winters around here way before humans have been looking after them, and so they tend to manage. But to be good stewards is our biggest priority. But the cocoons will survive, and there are examples that we were talking earlier about one worm bin pit that I found that was exposed to, it was in February I found it, and I lifted up a clump of ice and the worms were directly underneath you know, working away right directly under this little layer of ice. And they were hardy and they managed to survive.
Great. Looks like we have a couple more questions coming through the chat. The next one is, one advantage of bacterial composting is seed sterilization. Does this happen to any extent in vermicomposting?
I missed the question, I'm sorry.
One advantage of bacterial composting is seed sterilization. So the compost sterilizes the seeds. Do worms do that?
No, unless you're hot composting, they aren't sterilizing the seeds, but you'll often see the seeds start to sprout in your bin. So we were just looking at a bin here and they had some little melons growing. I've grown potatoes out of my bin, cantaloupe. So there's always a bit of a surprise, but on the other side, you can get weed seeds. I've just started adding shredded leaves from just my yard to the bins. And one downside to that was I was finding a lot of maple seeds, grass seeds sneaking in there from the leaf litter. So if you're worried about the seeds coming in, then you can definitely manage that by adding bedding that wouldn't have any seeds and then just being a little bit more selective with the food that you're feeding. Or you can hot compost, at least start the process of hot composting your food and your bedding before adding it. There are definitely some seeds that are a little bit more resilient and will maybe even make tomatoes. I don't like tomatoes. I've never grown tomatoes, but somehow I've never intentionally grown tomatoes. Somehow every year I get tomatoes in my garden. So some seeds are a little bit more resilient.
Yeah, I would agree with that and echo that if you're composting mostly food scraps, then there's no real concern for getting weed seeds in there unless it's in the bedding. But the castings are very fertile, and it's been my experience that seeds in there will sprout and then become more worm food.
Great. One more pressing question here. I have had slime mold a couple of times over the last few years in my vermicomposter in my kitchen. I've tried keeping it drier when this happens, and I'll try adding coconut coir after the presentation. Any other suggestions? I've never had problems with odor, but the slime mold looks unattractive.
I mean, that just sounds cool.
Yeah.
It's definitely possible that no matter what you're adding to your bin, does slime mold have spores? I don't know how it reproduces, but whatever is creating the slime mold is just present. So if you don't want the slime mold, starting over with a fresh bin or taking everything out, scrubbing it, and new materials might help. But it sounds cool. I guess it could take over, and that could be an issue. But yeah, that's the best I have.
Yeah, I don't know. My answer is I don't know. But I'll find out. We'll find out about that.
Yeah. And I'm curious to see if adding the coconut coir helps. Maybe learning a bit about the slime mold that you have and what kind of conditions would be more inhospitable to it could help. But I've never seen that in a bin before. So it would
be interesting to mix the slime mold into the bedding and see whether the other organisms in the bedding can manage the exposure of the slime mold. Whether it just becomes another part of another food source for the organisms and the worms. But I don't know. I don't have any experience with that.
Great. One other comment that back to the seed problem, using worm tea would be a way to help alleviate any other seed pressure or seed problems you might have in your castings.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I will also, no more comments at the moment, but I'll just remind folks on this presentation that we are recording everything and that you will all have access to this presentation after the fact. So if you didn't get a screenshot of something or wanted to view this again, you will be receiving information about how to view every presentation for the summer conference, follow after the conference itself.
So if I talk too quickly and you didn't catch what I said, you can just slow it down. Maybe that will help. Great.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you all for attending.
Great. Looks like we are, have answered all the questions that have been asked on the chat. So I would just like to say thanks again to Julia and Ben for spreading your enthusiasm and knowledge with us this evening, kicking off our NOFA Summer Conference 2020 to a great start here. And I'd like to thank everyone, all of our participants again for making the time this evening. First evening of 3 weeks of lots of informative and educational workshops. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being a part of NOFA. And we'll look forward to seeing you the rest of the evenings these coming weeks.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
All right. Take care. Good night.
Good night.